Hi, everyone. In this session, we're going to be talking about vocabulary and background knowledge. As a refresher, last time we talked about 70% of eighth graders not reading on grade level. This data is also reflective at the 12th grade level and the 4th grade level. So what does that mean for your classroom? We also talked about Scarborough's reading rope and that all of those components happen and all of those components have to happen simultaneously in your brain in order to get to reading comprehension. And so as we go throughout our course, we're going to be pulling out a few threads at a time and looking at how we instruct our secondary students on each one of these strands. We also talked about the 3 types of non-readers. We want to keep these students in mind as we're instructing. How do we elevate and scaffold and support our instruction for each type of these students? So those students who are not decoding, the students who are disfluent, or the students who can read well, but they're not comprehending or attending to the text. Let's look at the language comprehension strands, and we're going to start pulling those apart. The first thread we're going to look at is background knowledge. Background knowledge supports all 3 types of these readers. Most specifically, students who can decode, they may even be fluent readers, but they're not understanding what they're reading. And a lot of that has to do with background knowledge and vocabulary. And if we can build these skills up, we can help students have better reading comprehension. If I said to you this sentence without any context, that the notes were sour because the seam split. If I give you a second to think about that, we see things through the lens of our own experience. So you may be thinking about music, maybe the notes refer to a musical instrument, or wine. A lot of people say wine. If you're in Kentucky or Tennessee, they might say whiskey or bourbon because it's all about that seam in the barrel. What this is really referring to is bagpipes. If you haven't had any personal experience with bagpipes, hearing those or seeing how those function, we might not know that that's what this is about. So even though I can decode it, I can read it fluently, I have no context of it because I don't have the background knowledge or the experience with it. Hugh Katz says, chief among the factors influencing reading comprehension is background knowledge. Research clearly shows that how much readers understand about the text topic before they read it is a major factor in how much they understand while and after they read it. So this is an area where a lot of teachers want to cut corners and just dive into the lesson. That front loading or those mini lessons that take place before we get into the text are of more value than even our read-along text. So every text needs a before, a during, and an after reading strategy. And those before reading strategies should be all about building background knowledge, activating these prior experiences students may have had, making connections, previewing any vocabulary they won't understand. And all this has to be done first. It's critical to build up their knowledge before we begin reading. I'm not going to go in and start reading a text that takes place in World War II without making sure that students have the background knowledge they need to understand the time period, to understand the cultural. However, there is a deficit of background knowledge that we want to be aware of. One text that I love, and I will encourage you to read or at least add to your professional library for somewhere down the road, is by Natalie Wexler, and it's called The Knowledge Gap. She's a research journalist. She spent years going around classrooms all over the United States, sitting in, observing what and how of what's being taught and how it's being taught, and putting together this analysis. And this has provided so much insight. And one of those findings is that only 1% of primary students, so students in kindergarten, first and second grade, 1% of those students are receiving instruction in the fields of science and social studies, meaning they're not getting science and social studies instruction, they're getting reading and math. Why? Because reading and math are what is tested in 3rd grade. Of course, we know that reading and math are foundational for all other subjects, but as we're going to talk about today, background knowledge has so much impact and influence on reading comprehension that we can't eliminate it from instruction. We've actually shot ourselves in the foot, and we've had this spiral, this downward spiral of reading achievement, because when we've taken science and social studies out of the equation, out of our daily agenda for elementary students, we continue to see their background knowledge go down. So when students go into sixth grade, you find sixth grade science or social studies teachers appalled because they have absolutely no background knowledge of basic things like planets or clouds in school that are this common base of knowledge. Most of our students are lacking that. And then in grades 3, 4, 5, those intermediate grades, science and social studies is taught, but it's taught on a very limited basis. Students might get social studies for the first 9 weeks, science for the next 9 weeks, or maybe social studies for the first semester, science for the second semester. It might be for 20 minutes a day, or it might be for 45 minutes a week. It's also the first thing to get cut if there's a fog delay or an assembly or a PEP session, any of those things, because we have worked so hard to guard our reading and math time at the expense of science and social studies instruction. The main reason behind doing that is because we've seen our reading achievement decline. So the rationale was, we're not doing reading well, let's do more of it. We're not doing math well, let's add a math lab. When I was in middle school, I really struggled as a learner in math. If you would have made me do 3 hours of math a day, I would have hated school. And that's what we're doing to students all the time. And the research around it shows us that that approach is not effective, but still so many schools utilize that. And in order to make room for more reading and math intervention, and in order to make room for more reading and math intervention, we had to eliminate something from the schedule, and that's typically science, social studies, or the fun stuff, choir, music, art. Now with the movement in the science of reading, these are coming to light, and the shift is starting to go back the other way to where we're starting to understand the importance of science and social studies content in the common base curriculum, and value that and make sure that that is included in our daily schedule for all students. There's something called the baseball study, and this was originally done in 1988. However, it's been replicated over and over. The study takes 4 groups of students and has them read a passage about baseball and answer questions. Of those 4 groups of students, 2 groups are high readers, 2 groups are low readers. 2 groups have high knowledge of baseball. So they've played it, they've experienced it, they are familiar with the vocabulary and how it works. The other 2 groups are not. The assumption is that the 2 higher reader groups, regardless of their background knowledge, will score higher. What research has found is that the students who are low readers but have high knowledge of baseball outperform stronger readers. They're just below those high background knowledge, high reading group. And it all comes back to background knowledge. They understand how the game works. They know the vocabulary involved. Think of all the vocabulary in baseball: pitcher, mound, pop fly, fielding. Those are all things that you would understand if you've played baseball. And if you've taken ed psych, you probably remember the term schema. Schema is very much connected with background knowledge. If you think of your brain as this filing cabinet, all of the information coming in has to have somewhere to go. It might be filed in the wrong place, or you can file it in the correct place. Part of learning is unlearning things that are incorrect. And you can relate that to the filing system of moving information or recategorizing information. But in order to acquire new information, you have to already know a little bit about the topic. So we have to have some type of file folder in there or attach it to previous experiences and learning. Curiosity is also an interesting thing. We are curious about those things that we already know a little bit about. For example, I'm not curious about how to rebuild a motorcycle engine because I know 0 about that. I am curious about languages or dialects in different regions of the country because I know a lot about linguistics, and that's an interest. So I already have some knowledge base, and I'm curious about things to be able to grow my knowledge. I'm not curious about things I have no idea on. Students are the same way. So we have to build that background knowledge little by little. Great ways to do this are images, pictures, photographs, short video clips. There's something called principles of learning acquisition. And these are a few that are related to prior knowledge or background knowledge. So I want to mention these. The most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. That's what we just mentioned with schema. But prior knowledge is even more important than IQ or learning styles. Meaningfulness, relatedness stems directly from prior knowledge. Every mental operation hinges upon ease of access to information you acquired earlier in life. And you can maybe you've experienced this with you learned Spanish in high school and you're very rusty and you haven't picked it up in several years, but you pick up Duolingo or Rosetta Stone and it seems to come back really quickly. You think, hey, I might be pretty good at this. Well, you're accessing information that you've already had at one time, and that's why it feels like that. Same thing with a musical instrument. Maybe you played the piano when you were a child. As an adult, you try it again and you pick it up much more quickly. And then I love this saying, easy or hard is determined by your individual learning history. Easy or hard is all subjective based on your past experiences. I hope this begins to lay the foundation of the importance of building background knowledge before you get into reading a text with your students. One of the great things that we can do with students as a pre-teaching activity to really check and evaluate where their background knowledge is to do something called an anticipation guide. An anticipation guide is just a quick true or false quiz. Might be 5 questions, might be 10. You can do a whole group, you can do it with partners. It can be very informal, almost like a survey. And so you're asking questions about the topic or about the text. They go through and they answer this before you've ever read anything. And then you check their answers. That determines a few things. If the majority of students already know what you're talking about or have a really solid base, you know that you can review. If the majority of your students don't know anything about the topic, the region, the text, then you're going to need to dig in a little bit deeper and do some longer units of study before you begin reading your text. And then you can also use that anticipation guide as your after reading strategy, because you don't give them the questions or you don't give them the answers right away. You revisit those after the reading, because what that does, it piques their interest. They want to know if they're right or not. And then as we come back to that, they can check their learning and really evaluate themselves and then correct anything that they were wrong. We're going to look at this resource a few times throughout the semester. But John Hattie is an Australian researcher, and he's done a meta-analysis, which is basically a study of all the studies. And so this particular study is called Visible Learning. So he's taken over 250 components, influences in a student's education. So for example, homework. So I've taken homework, I found all the research that has been done on homework to really evaluate what I know about it. That's the meta-analysis piece. So education is not this mystery or guess. We have decades and decades of research that tells us what works for students, what doesn't work for students, what is the most impactful. And this even breaks it down by color-coded how effective it is. So there's something called an impact size, which is basically the effect size. So it's color-coded, like dark blue is the most impactful. And we look at the numbers, and there are strategies that you can use that you can gain a year's growth, but there are strategies that you can use that will gain 3 to 4 years growth. With having only a little bit of time with our students every day, and knowing that they're so far behind their grade level, which strategies should we be using? Obviously, those high impact strategies. So we're going to be looking at those and make sure that we're utilizing the most high impact strategies. And I also would love for you to be familiar with some of these strategies so that when you're in your classroom this semester, you're really observing what strategies they're using. And you can use this as a guide. Anything you're seeing take place in the classroom, you can come back and calibrate it with this sheet. Was that strategy that they just used? How effective was that? You can go back to your research base here, the visible learning document, to see. This is a treasure. This is gold right here. And I want to make sure that you're familiar with it and you can come back to it. And it really applies to any learning that we do as children, adults, and in any situation. One of the things that the visible learning does is show us the need for background knowledge and for previewing text and the best ways that we can teach that background knowledge. Graphic organizers, visual representations, and we can't water down that text. We have to keep it grade level because that's what they'll be tested at, grade level. So we have to teach them strategies that will help them to be able to access that grade level text, not just water it down by giving them something easier. So if this was a live session and we were together, I would have us do some discussion over this, but the knowledge gap just isn't about our students. It also refers to teachers. And here's a few quotes that I want to look at and then have you think about. The students of knowledgeable teachers are more likely to progress than the students of those teachers who lack understanding of language structures. Something to think about. The single most important determinant of success for students is the knowledge and skills of that child's teacher. So your skills, not only in your content area, but your teaching skills, your delivery skills are crucial. Maybe you've had a teacher or professor that was very knowledgeable about their content, but maybe their delivery wasn't as effective or wasn't as clear. So our job is not only to be an expert in our content, but to be able to explain that in such a clear way that anyone can understand it. And take it a step further and know how to apply it. Give them space to practice the application of those skills, which many teachers don't. They have a fire hose of information for students and then they move on to the next thing because they're really focused on pacing with their curriculum and not where their students are, what their students can take in. And then the last quote is also about professional development and academic success. So if you have the disposition as a teacher to understand how valuable reading is, to understand that you don't know everything and that's okay. We want to come into teaching and sometimes we want to really prove ourselves. So we don't want to ask questions. We don't want to seem incompetent. No one thinks you incompetent if you ask questions. They would prefer you ask questions and get it right than guess and get it wrong. So be humble enough to ask questions, ask for help, ask for clarity, to stop someone and say, I believe this is what you're saying, but I just want to clarify and retell what you think you understand. That will help save so much time and so many mistakes. Another way we can build background knowledge is by reading aloud to students. And I get this question a lot. Are audiobooks okay for students? Well, it depends. If the content is what they need, then audiobooks is fine, or you reading aloud is fine. If we're working on building their fluency and their actual physical act of reading, then physical reading is what needs to take place. But a great way to build background knowledge is from read alouds, podcasts, different type of audio things. This will help support all three categories of those learners, non-decoders, dysfluent, and then our third category of non-comprehenders. If you look at an MRI image of someone listening to reading, the same parts of the brain are activated. So they're having the same experience as if they were physically reading. And that's a good thing. They're thinking about the text, and that's what we want. We just also need to make sure we're creating space to practice reading out loud to develop fluency for those students who need that skill. But it comes back to ask the question, what's the goal here? Is it the content, that they get this content, or is it they physically practice their reading? If they just need the content, then how can we get that to them efficiently? I can read it aloud. We can listen to an audiobook. But if we're doing that, we're making sure that we're doing a lot of stop and think alouds during the reading. One of the changes that has happened with the science of reading legislation is the curriculum. So now in the state of Indiana and in most states, there's a list that curriculum vendors or curriculum companies have to get on in order to be on this approved list. And now schools have to shop for curriculum on this approved list. They can't just go out and make any purchase that they want to, which was the case just a few years ago. So now we have this approved list that we have to shop from. The big difference in the curriculum now that we're seeing from traditional curriculum to the newer approved science of reading curriculum is the length and depth of the topics of study. So instead of just reading a text or having themes like friendship or identity, they're very much focused on time periods. For example, it might be all on a study of Rome for an entire semester, and then really diving into Greek mythology. So it's going in depth of topics instead of hitting lots of topics kind of shallowly over a short period of time. So it's these long, in-depth units of study. And we'll look at some of these throughout the semester also, so that you can get a feel for what that looks like and what might be expected. So I just want to do a stop and check, or let's consolidate what we've talked about so far. How does background knowledge impact comprehension? So just taking a minute, putting it in your own words, thinking about it. What have you learned? What's your takeaway? So we're going to talk about vocabulary next as the next thread in Scarborough's rope on that top strand of language comprehension. There are two levels to vocabulary: expressive and receptive. Receptive vocabulary refers to words we understand when we're listening or reading. And words we use when we're speaking or writing are expressive vocabulary. So those are two levels of learning, and that means that will dictate two different ways or methods of teaching. This is my favorite quote on vocabulary, and I'm going to read it because I couldn't say it any better. A person who knows more words can speak and even think more precisely about the world. A person who knows the terms scarlet, crimson, azure, and indigo can think about colors in a different way than a person who is limited to red and blue. Words divide the world. The more words we have, the more complex ways we can think about the world. So not only is vocabulary important because it's going to be on this test, or we need to understand these words for this text, it literally changes the way that we can communicate in life. So I think of the toddler who's just learning to talk, and they can't say, "You took my toy, give it back," so they bite someone. Their response and their thinking is based on the limitation of their vocabulary. As we are teaching these morphing adolescents, vocabulary is so crucial for their learning, not just in our classroom, but for the rest of their life. So we have to prioritize teaching vocabulary. It should be among one of the most important things that we do. And I want to elevate this in our understanding of teaching English and language arts. Vocabulary should be of the utmost importance because it literally changes their ability and ways that they can think in complexity. It also increases their imagination because they would have the words to be able to imagine. And as a tie-in to reading comprehension, there's something called the Matthew effect, where the rich get richer. You have to know at least 90% of the words on a page in order to understand that text. If I understand at least 90, my brain, from context clues and inferencing, I can pull together the rest of the information. If I know less than 90% of the words, that gap is too big for my brain to fill, and I'm not going to be able to understand this text. So again, this is why pre-teaching vocabulary is crucial. If I'm a good reader, I continue to read things, I'm going to learn more words. The more words I know, the higher level text I can read. Conversely, if I have a limited vocabulary and then my teacher gives me text that I can access that's more watered down, then my vocabulary is going to plateau. And that's where we see that achievement gap really stretch. So that rich get richer and those poor just remain where they are. The three obstacles in teaching vocabulary: number one, the sheer quantity of words. English has the largest vocabulary of any other languages, over 2 million words. We absorb languages from all different, from countries and dialects. Also, many of the words that we expect students to learn are decontextualized. So they're just on this isolated list with no context. And then the third reason it's difficult to teach vocabulary is because we don't want words just at this receptive level. We want them typically at the expressive level, to where they're in my internal lexicon and I'm using them on a regular basis. When teaching vocabulary, we have to ask ourselves a question. How will my students need to use this word? When I look at the long list of vocabulary words that I need to teach my students for the year or for this unit, I need to go through the list intentionally and ask this question of every single vocabulary word. How well do they need to know this word? If they need to know this word well enough that they're going to use it the rest of their life, they need to be able to talk about it, include it in their vocabulary, they're going to use it in multiple subject areas, not just my classroom, then that requires explicit instruction. The average list is 2,000 to 3,000 words a year that students need to learn to keep on pace with academic standards. That's a ton. There's no way we have time to explicitly teach 2,000 to 3,000 words. And when I say explicit, it means that I'm actually instructing. Here's the word, how to say it, here's what it means, here's examples. So at no time does teaching vocabulary ever look like, here's a list of words, go find the definition. That is not teaching vocabulary. Explicit vocabulary instruction looks like instruction. You're deconstructing parts of the word, you're explaining those word parts, you're using it in context, and you're immediately asking students to use it in context. That's explicit instruction. This is the type of instruction we need to use if students are going to be required to use the term the rest of their lives and in many different subjects. If it's a term where they just need to have that receptive understanding, I hear it, I know what it means, I can go on and just figure out the rest in context, implicit instruction is fine. Implicit means that context. And this is typically why it's important to model great vocabulary and use content-rich text, because we're going to be exposed to a lot of language. Students will implicitly gain a large vocabulary by intense exposure to rich language, interspersed with brief discussions of meanings. Furthermore, they believe that it's more efficient to spend time listening and reading interesting materials. So we really have to have both of these types of instructions, explicit and implicit, because if we have 2,000 words we need to teach students every year, and that's just not our class, that's combined with all classes, we need to look at our list and really scrutinize how students need to be able to use this word in the future, because that will dictate how I teach it. How do we decide? Well, we categorize our vocabulary. We take a text and we pull out all the tier 1, 2, or 3 words. So tier 1 words are common words known by everyone. And that is a typo on the slide. It says umber, it should be under. So words that everyone knows. Tier 2 words are known as high utility words, and they're essential for understanding the text, but you also use these in all subject areas and even in life. And then tier 3 words are less common, typically found in one field of study. So these would be science terms like electrodes. And one of the great uses of AI is popping in a passage and then asking it to provide the tier 1, 2, and 3 vocabulary words for you. And most of the time it does a pretty good job of doing an initial first sort. What we know from research is that we have to prioritize teaching tier 2 words, because these are the words that students will use across their lifespan that will elevate their general knowledge and vocabulary. So these are the words that should be explicitly taught. Whenever we get the chance, our emotion is really connected with memory. Anytime we can show a video clip or an image that goes along with a vocabulary word will be so effective. I've inserted the clip here, but one of the things that I taught in a humanities block was tsunamis. And so instead of just giving the definition or even a still photo like this, I showed a clip from the movie Impossible, where the family was vacationing at Christmas in Thailand. and the tsunami comes across and just devastates everything. So that is a very tense, stressful clip, and it helps students remember what a tsunami is. You don't have this opportunity for every word that you come across, but if you do, don't miss an opportunity. One part of vocabulary challenges are polysemous words or words with multiple meanings. When you're previewing a text, you want to pull out any words that have multiple meanings. Sometimes students know a word, but only know one definition of a word. So I want to try a quick activity with you. So what would a jersey mean to a rancher, someone from New England, and an athlete? A jersey, I mentioned earlier, we see things through the lens of our own experience. So for a rancher, a jersey is a type of cow. So if you say Jersey, that's probably what they will think of. If you're from New England, you'll think New Jersey or Jersey Shore area. And if you're an athlete, you're going to think, part of the uniform. So pulling out these terms is really important, because if I only know the term jersey as part of the uniform, but I'm referring to a geographical location or a cow, that definitely changes the meaning of the text. So highlighting and pulling those out and previewing those words with students before you begin reading is essential. One of the other strategies that's very helpful, also a pre-teaching or pre-reading strategy, you can even do this at the beginning of the year or the beginning of a new unit of study. You put all the words students should know or you want them to know by the end of the unit. Then you put categories. So they've never seen the word, they kind of know the word, or they know it and use it all the time. And you go through this list together. So you are saying the words out loud so that they can hear them, because some words sound different from how they look. And so you have to say the word out loud, and then they just go through and do a quick check and self-evaluate. That's not going to be shown to anyone. And then after the unit of study or after the semester, this kind of acts as your progress monitoring tool. They come back and they can reevaluate those words. How well do they know those? And hopefully they've moved over to the right one column at least. And that's just a vocabulary self-check. One of the things that we want to do is find a method of explicitly teaching vocabulary and stick with it. It's also helpful if it's used in other classrooms. So if your team or your department is utilizing it, that's going to help kids too. So this is the Frere model, something you might be already familiar with. The word goes in the middle. Then in the boxes, you have a definition, facts and characteristics, sentences, or examples. These can change based on what you need. So if it's a scientific example or more of a content term like photosynthesis, then you might have, characteristics and facts. If it's a word like achievement, then maybe you have synonyms and antonyms and not characteristics. But every term should have an image, even if they're drawing an icon or image that represents that. And what's key is it has to be the student's definition. If they are copying something from the original source and they don't understand it, it will not stick. Remember, we just talked about schema. If I don't have any knowledge of this or what other words mean in this sentence, I'm not going to retain it long term. So make sure you're explaining it in your explicit instruction, which is why we just can't have them copying definitions independently out of a book or from an original source. I have to be giving and explaining the words, using it in examples. Then they interpret that, or at least I'm using student-friendly definition, and that's what they write on their paper. That is key. If you don't have the student-friendly language or it's not written in their words, none of the other steps are going to matter. So you've got to get that first step right. And if you think of it this way, when we teach vocabulary, the word is in the middle of your hand. And this represents a spider web. So the more ways that we can manipulate or do things with this word, the stickier it will be to my brain and retaining it. So I might have the definition, the part of speech, an image, synonym, an antonym, an example, a non-example, and that's going to get it as sticky as possible. If I have the word and the definition, that's not sticky. If I have the word, a sentence, that's not sticky. You have to be able to utilize it and manipulate it at least 5 different ways to get any kind of stick to it. So it takes time to teach vocabulary, but if we're going to do it, we need to do it right. Another method you can try is called the 7 Steps to Vocab, and this was developed by Margarita Calderon. What is great about this is you take that word, and remember I was just talking about 5 different ways to make it sticky. She takes it through 7 steps, and everything is scripted out. So the word is manage, say manage 3 times, and then she gives the example. And then she has students turn around and use the example right away. I'm going to include a video by Anita Archer that gives her a video of her where she is modeling the explicit instruction of vocabulary. So it is a great example of what first-time vocabulary instruction looks like. And so here's the video. The video is linked in your module, so make sure you look at that. It's a 17-minute video. Just watch the first 5 minutes. It gets redundant after that. But watch her go through the entire process of one word so that you can see what the method is. The other thing that's crucial that we need to teach and keep in mind are our Latin and Greek roots or morphemes, our prefixes and suffixes. So even taking the 100 most used prefixes and suffixes will help students unlock the meaning of so many different words. We can teach our roots and affixes is to teach one at a time, to pronounce them orally, to look at the spelling of them, to look at the word origin. Understanding word origin will help their understanding of language in general. Remember the first session, we talked about linguistics is the study of language, and it's appropriate for all students, whether they're a struggling reader or whether they're a gifted and talented reader. It's going to bring so much clarity to language in general. So I want to take just a minute and look at some word origin. Anglo-Saxon words of origin are typically those polysemous words, words that have multiple meanings. And I've listed a few here: stand, cap, jam, the list goes on. Characteristics of these words, they're often one syllable. They use a vowel team, so 2 vowels together that make one sound. And they also include silent letters. Those are characteristics of words from an Anglo-Saxon origin. They're also typically common everyday words. Numbers, animals, pronouns, prepositions, and compound words are also Anglo-Saxon origin. French words are typically associated with the fields of government, law, military, fashion, and food. So you'll see a lot of French words in the English language from those categories. It's actually around 1 to 2/3 of our vocabulary have French roots. So understanding some of those identifiers is important. With Greek and Latin, it's important because it impacts pronunciation. So whenever you see that CH that makes the K sound, you're going to know that that is of Greek origin, and it's typically in science fields. Latin words are built around prefixes and suffixes. So any of those spellings with the CH K sound or the PH makes the F sound. And if you think back to, if you've ever watched the spelling bee, the script spelling bee, and the children or students will ask, what's the origin of the word? Because this matters. If it's a Greek origin, they know it makes a K sound. It's most likely a CH spelling. When students ask, why is this word spelled like that? You can bring up the topic of word origins. So you're going to have in your module just a quick little quiz. You can take it multiple times till you get it right, and just do some matching from words to their origin and just giving your best guess based on those slides. And then morpheme mapping. The morpheme is the smallest unit of a word that has meaning. And so I break out the morphemes in each word, and I can do this ahead of time. So for the word projective, I bring out this prefix pro, which means for or forward, the root word ject, which means to throw, and then IVE, the suffix, which means ability to. If they don't have those roots and affixes memorized, that's fine, I provide them. But then they fill in this bottom row here. So for the mapping, I would say projective means the ability to throw forward. And I would touch each one of those screens and help them understand that parts of words work together to build a word. There's not one word that means one thing. Same thing with eruption. We pull out the prefix and the suffix and the root. E means out, rupt means to burst, and ION is act of. So act of bursting out. And then if we have a prefix that means not, we start with that first. So for the word incredible, we would say not able to believe. Also, we want to teach vocabulary words in word families. I'm not just teaching the word mobile, I'm teaching the word mobile, what it means, going through all of those 5 parts to make it sticky. But I'm also going to say, hey, when you see the word mobile, you might also see it in these other contexts. And here's the list of words. And then that becomes a nice anchor chart on the wall. But if you know one word in the family, then that will help unlock the meaning of all the other relatives. One of the other things we can do is a word matrix where we provide options for prefixes and suffixes around a root word. Ask students to build new words and provide the definition. So even if it might maybe not be a real word, if they can put a new word together and provide the definition, then that can be kind of a fun game, and it gets to the point of what we're doing. We want them to understand the morphemes or word parts in order to make new words and to understand the structure of words and how words are built. How do we get into writing paragraphs and essays if we don't understand sentence structure? We don't understand sentence structure many times because we don't understand the structure of a word. And so we have to break it all the way back down to this piece. This is going to wrap up our session for this week. Please email me or let me know if you have any questions, and I'll check in with you throughout the week.